What were you saying, Josh?
You could make the argument that one nuclear bomb is more humane.
Yes.
People died in an instant. They didn't even know what was happening.
That's right.
They didn't have to watch their face.
Some people did, yes. If you were near the explosion itself, directly within a certain amount of kilometers, then yes, most likely would have been incinerated instantaneously. A lot of other people had to live through the horrifying ravages of basically the nuclear fallout that occurs afterwards. So if you didn't know, Tucker Carlson went on Joe Rogan to do many a thing. Amongst those things were things that I thought would get a little bit more, I guess, attention. Let's see if I can pull up the evolution one. Tucker evolution. The search function on X is like almost completely unusable, so it's kind of hard to use. Oh, actually, I could try. Yeah, Google. Google's better at finding things on Twitter than Twitter is at finding things on Twitter. So, okay, so here's one of the things that they were talking about.
Cares about you. You're important to the people around you.
But if we don't think people are important, then what do we think is important? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Not necessarily that we don't think people are important, but if evolution is real, and if there is this constant,
it real?
I don't know, but it's visible. Like you can measure it in certain animals.
You can measure adaptation.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence that in fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin is like kind of not true. Right?
In what sense?
Oh no. No, Elon, say it ain't so. I thought this was like the #1 source for video. Why is the video player so shit? Why is everything so shit?
Cell organism and over time, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not. And
there's not a fossil record of transitionary species, like species.
Oh God! So he goes on to say that like it's been disproven at this point that we all evolved from a single cell micro organism. Orgasm, I believe, is the exact technical term, and that's not what the theory of evolution claims. I guess we have to rational wiki a little bit today, but let's go into the old school. Evolution refers to a change in biological populations' inherited traits from generation to generation. All species on Earth originated by the mechanism of evolution through the descent from common ancestors. Evolution occurs as change accumulated over generations. Charles Darwin recognized evolution by natural selection, but also called descent with modification as the fundamental process for underlying of all life. Whether viewed at large scale above the level of species, macroevolution in terms of formation of new species, changes within lineages and extinction, or at a small scale within species, microevolution in terms of the change in gene frequency. In a nutshell, evolution by natural selection can be simplified to the following principles. Variability. Individuals in a population display differences in form, physiology, and behavior. Differential fitness. Differences between individuals confer different survival and reproductive rates. Hereditary. Differences in fitness can pass on to subsequent generations. In modern genetic terminology, variable traits of the population is the expression or the phenotype of heritable traits known as the genes, which at least on Earth are stored in DNA, sometimes referred to as RNA in proteins. Variability of traits ultimately originates from mutation, and new combinations of genes continuously produced by recombination as part of sexual reproduction. The result of natural selection is adaptation, like a, quote, hand-in-a-glove fit between organisms and environment. Evolution, defined in populational genetics as a change in gene frequency in a population, can be influenced by other processes besides natural selection, including genetic drift, random changes, especially in small population, gene flow, when the new genes come to the population from other populations. In a sense, mutation is an innovative process of explanation in which new possibilities come into existence, most of which don't work so well, and this is balanced by natural selection, a process of contradiction that reduces the possibilities to those that work best in a particular environment. Something that like not only has obviously our understanding of it has come a very long way since the original theory of evolution was proposed by Charles Darwin, but now thanks to things like, you know, understanding the entire genetic composition of human DNA, we've actually done the let's catalog our own phenotype style experiments. We understand deeply more the beauty and intricacy of our very existence. It's not something to be scared and run away from and think that we've actually gone in the opposite direction of disproving it as time has gone on. If anything, the collective body of science has kind of proven that yes, in fact, the natural selection aspects of evolution were on point.
That are adapting to its environment.
There's tons of record of adaptation, and you see it in your own life. I mean, I have a lot of dogs. I see adaptation in dogs, you know, through the litter to litter. But no, there's no evidence at all that zero, that, you know, people, you know, evolve seamlessly from a single cell amoeba. No, there's not. There's no chain in the fossil record of that at all. And that's why you don't actually hear people, you hear them make reference to evolution.
So again, just all wild stuff that I thought this was going to garner a little bit more outrage, but not a lot of people lost their shit about it. As strange as it is, he did something even stranger, which is this one now being retweeted by Alex Jones. Can't believe Alex Jones said the 9/11 attacks in July before it happened. He literally said, "What happened on 9/11? This is exactly what the USA is doing. How was the speech if he wasn't the big thing in the media? Mind blowing, literally." So watch this video, everybody.
I have to say, your willingness to platform or to have
and Cosmology Dragon, thank you very much for resubscribing with the Prime. Oh God. X, Twitter, what's happening to you? You're dying a weird death. Tucker Carlson, when he had Alex Jones on his show, played a lot of the same clips, and Alex Jones has been playing them as well. And a lot of people on the right have been playing them to show that Alex Jones is always right. Did you know that Alex Jones actually predicted 9/11? And so I wanted to do a little quick debunking video for all y'all.
We know the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to blow up airliners, Baltimore Sun.
This is not a prediction. Alex Jones is referencing an article that talks about an already known potential plan to blame a terrorist attack on communist Cuba in 1962 known as Operation Northwood. The same article goes on to say that Kennedy ultimately rejected it because he did not want direct conflict with Cuba.
Or if you let some terrorist group do it, like the World Trade Center, we know who to blame. And if there was an outside threat like a bin Laden, who was a known CIA asset in the 80s.
These two clips are edited together to make it look like Alex Jones went from talking about a potential attack on the World Trade Center with that very attack being committed by Osama bin Laden. But the second clip is actually just back to referencing the article from the Baltimore Sun that names Osama bin Laden as a suspected terrorist financier. Bin Laden founded Al-Qaeda in 1988 and was already a well-known radicalized anti-American figure by this point. Factually, there had been examples prior to 9/11 of failed attempts to crash planes into buildings, including the lawn of the White House. In 2000, the FAA's annual report on criminal acts against aviation said that, quote, although Osama bin Laden is not known to have attacked civil aviation, he has both the motivation and the wherewithal to do so, specifically naming him as a significant threat to civil aviation. This report became heavily referenced after 9/11 as proof of some sort of connection between the government and the attacks. However, not taking warnings seriously enough is not the same as co-planning the attack.
Jones did.
Sorry, didn't realize I was muted there. So I wanted to say, if you want to watch the full video, go to youtube.com/@mindexplosions, because I went into a bit more detail afterwards about how it's so weird that Alex Jones and all these conspiracy theorists love talking about how, hey, Alex Jones was right. He predicted 9/11. Like, he actually said that this is exactly what was going to happen. Who was going to do it? All this kind of stuff. And it's like, no, he didn't. In fact, it's being deceptively edited together to try and look like he was predicting something when what he was doing was reading parts of an article at the time that also referenced the fact that, yes, Osama bin Laden was already a well-known CIA asset. Sorry, not CIA asset, but well-known potential threat to American aviation at that time. And so Alex Jones is not, the Jones Stradamus or anything like that. But the actual story of 9/11 and how Osama bin Laden got radicalized and how he was initially a well-off, privileged member of the Saudi family, not directly the Saudis themselves in power, but his father had connections to the Saudi royals. Like, that kind of stuff is the things that you would think that people like Alex Jones would want to talk about, and talk about how U.S. involvement in the Middle East radicalized him, and what took place after the U.S.'s involvement in Afghanistan with the brave Mujahideen fighters, and what took place. They don't want to talk about the actual story. They'd rather talk about things that make it seem as if they're right, or always right, or always correct. Like Alex Jones, he predicted this kind of stuff. He knows what they're talking about. And then we're going on to the next part, which is a lot of right-wingers have now made videos on the Tucker Carlson interview because of the nukes, because of nuking Japan. That's the next part.
I've spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil. If you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil.
Tucker, you're an idiot for saying that. I don't need to know anything else you need to say about nukes and World War II. If you say the United States shouldn't have them, that's naive. You're now in the climate catastrophe group that says everybody else should basically upend their economy, spend trillions of dollars, and kill people for doing it. But China's never going to do anything, and so it's the climate change thing. You're in that group now.
I'll just
Notwithstanding the Holocaust, the Nazis, they were good to. No one said 200,000. So there is no evil that you can possibly imagine if you look at what the Japanese imperialists believed in. And of course, notwithstanding the Holocaust, the Nazis, they were, I don't know if you've heard of the axis of evil. But look at how the Japanese and Chinese treated each other during that period of time.
Yeah.
So you'd have to accept this on its face by completely eliminating the history of Japan and what they believed, and completely eliminating the statistics regarding lives lost. If you do that, then yes, you can say anyone who believes that the nuclear bombs dropped was the right decision is evil. Then you can say that, but you have to acknowledge that first.
Yeah, and what is the difference between an atomic bomb and bombing cities so many times that you kill that many people or more?
Right.
Is it just because you have a very effective bomb? What about the firebombing of Tokyo? Was that okay, but because it's a nuclear weapon, we shouldn't go to one bomb doing all that damage?
Well, I think most people would probably point towards the fact that if you're doing firebombing, especially on, what was known at the time as the Paper City, for example, where a lot of the structures, the houses, the buildings that civilians were living in were, again, incinerated in horrifying ways, that you might point towards that campaign also being fucked. We're going to go into the actual a little bit of the history. There's a 3.5-hour video by Sean that we're going to watch in its entirety right now. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it should help explain a little bit more of this.
We should at least have to send 50 planes, 100 planes to do that kind of damage.
Sorry, 4.5 hours. It's 4.5 hours.
I don't understand the point that he's even trying to make there.
You could argue
A,
that
it's wrong on the history, and B, it's wrong just in theory of war.
Right. What were you saying, Josh?
You could make the argument that one nuclear bomb is more humane.
Yes.
People died in an instant. They didn't even know what was happening.
That's right.
They didn't have to watch their face.
Some people did. Yes, if you were near the explosion itself, directly within a certain amount of kilometers, then yes, most likely would have been incinerated instantaneously. A lot of other people had to live through the horrifying ravages of basically the nuclear fallout that occurs afterwards. Which,
way to go.
They didn't have to watch their baby fly out of a building as they're being bombed, or throw their baby in front of a tank or something, like, whatever crazy stuff they're going to do.
I think we would all accept that war is inhumane.
Yes.
Period. War is inhumane. All of World War II was inhumane. But saving millions of lives, or at least eliminating the cost, I should say, the future cost of millions of lives through the war continuing as it existed, along with, if you look at what happened compared to, we could have used this with Pearl Harbor. The United States military dropped leaflets in Japanese cities before both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We did it. We said, like, hey, just so you know, your leaders hate you and want to use you as human shields. Please get out of these cities. Could have used that in Pearl Harbor.
A little bit.
Killing your ships. What?
They're like, no, we've got torpedoes.
And there we are. So, that's basically their take. But I think Ben has a similar one.
There's a weird horseshoe theory thing that's happening here. We've talked about it before on the program, that you have this constellation of far leftists who are rather friendly toward Hamas, who generally are isolationist on foreign policy, but they're isolationist on foreign policy mainly because they believe that the United States is a nefarious force in the world. They're sort of Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky with regard to American foreign policy. America is actually bad. That horseshoe theory has now swung all the way around, and it includes some people on the right. Now, as we'll talk about in a moment, when it comes to isolationism, as we've discussed, there are a bunch of different perspectives within the isolationist perspective. There is the we should not get involved in foreign conflicts no matter what perspective because we need the money here at home, which means that you're also in favor of cutting spending by the government on a wide variety of other subjects. There's also an isolationism that suggests that whenever America gets involved in foreign conflicts, that tends to taint the United States, not it's about the United States tainting the rest of the world. But there is a theory that has now arisen on the right that there is something deeply malign about the United States.
I like how the first example, he's basically referencing the Donald Trump form of nationalism, right? Where it's like, oh yes, Donald Trump, he said that he's a nationalist. He's very proud about that. He's not going to be involved in foreign interventionism. And then it's like, well, then why did he accelerate drone strikes after Obama? Like, what's going on there? Why did he assassinate Iranian generals? It seems as if that even if you posture as a political candidate, if you're like, hey, by the way, I'm going to be a nationalist, I'm not actually going to involve the United States in any kind of foreign conflicts and stuff like that, when people come into power, it's simply just not true.
Something deeply wrong with the United States. This was made apparent over the weekend. Tucker Carlson was on Joe Rogan's show. Obviously, I'm very friendly with Joe. I think Joe does a great job during his interviews. And there was a clip from this interview that went particularly viral. This is a clip in which Tucker Carlson calls the United States evil for having dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ending World War II, and then suggests that anyone who would justify that is also evil, which is a very traditionally left-wing perspective. It is not traditionally a particular.
Also, this is an interesting way to ask for American viewers. I don't know what you were taught in public school, because in public school in Canada, there was a similar narrative, right? Although the Canadian version is that Canada was way more involved in World War II than I'm sure any other country ever talks about Canadians' involvement in World War II. But essentially, the similar narrative of how the West and the democratic countries ended up winning and defeating the Nazis. Very little is actually paid towards the actions of, say, Stalin or the USSR or their involvement, but a lot is put towards, you know, D-Day. A lot of is put towards, hey, by the way, the Battle of Stalingrad, for example, stuff like that, in which it's like, well, we can actually point towards, you know, all the victories that were made only possible thanks to the West. And it actually ended with the bombing of Japan, because ultimately the emperor was unable to surrender. He never would, and he made unconditional surrender impossible. So eventually they had to drop the nukes. It was the only way to do it. And then afterwards, that's when they surrendered. And yeah, that's basically how World War II ended. That's the story.
Particularly right-wing perspective, because most people on the conservative side of the aisle.
We didn't learn about World War II, more about how we were used as cannon fodder by the colonists in World War I. We talked about how cool we were for saving everyone from the Nazis. I don't remember the mention of Canada in World War II in school. Well, we invented the bouncing bomb. That's what we learned in Canadian schools. Canada's contribution to the war effort there.
Tend to believe that America is a force for good in the world. And as we'll discuss, it turns out that dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was necessary for ending World War II and likely saved millions of lives, both American and.
And by the way, I'm not here, and this is not going to be part of the segment, to defend Imperial Japan. Imperial Japan was a horrifying dictatorship. Yes, and we're going to go a little bit into that. I feel of all the actors during World War II, in terms of people's post-World War II history and horror, oftentimes the Japanese, they somehow got a pass. But we will explain a little bit about that. But it still comes down to, was it necessary to drop the nuke? Which is a very big question. And I guess the second part to that would be, in so doing, did it effectively create the conditions in which Japan was finally capable of surrendering, did surrender, and then that effectively saved lives? So it was necessary to do in order to prevent more life loss, which was what was also taught.
Japanese. But here is Tucker.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work? How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that...
I mean, that led to the world that you love in a little way, Tucker. The idea of America becoming a world superpower. I mean, that's pretty much the start of the American empire being #1, baby.
People on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, you know, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
Right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, well, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening?
Okay, actually, what would be childish is to assume that there are no other players in the world, for example, trying to develop nuclear weapons.
I submit that if Tucker Carlson still had the show, the #1 show on Fox, that they wouldn't all be going after Tucker Carlson right now. But the best he can offer them at this point is basically some weird show on X. So it's like, well, I'm not really missing much by going after Tucker now.
The fact is the Nazis were trying to develop nuclear weapons. There was, in fact, a nuclear arms race that was happening at the time. Not only that.
Luckily, the Nazis decided to go on with a different project, a super-powered missile instead. Yeah.
As it turns out, the Soviet Union then developed nuclear weapons. And it is mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence that has kept the world largely from sinking into another World War III-like mass casualty morass because of the horror of dropping the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, I'd say more the fact that most of the most powerful nations on the planet have lots of nukes, and then the exploitation of, let's say, poorer nations, or as they're usually called, less developed nations, third world countries, is more possible. There's a lot more proxy wars that take place during the Cold War as a result of it, because, yeah, you don't want direct confrontation between nuclear powers. I think at this point everyone kind of recognizes that there's no such thing as a casual nuclear war. You know, as fun as it is to do the whole Fallout stuff, and we can all build our bunkers, and we'll come up in a couple hundred years after living off canned goods, and there'll be mutants, and it'll be fun, and ghouls. Ooh, ghouls, that sounds neat. But it's pretty much the end of all life on Earth if there is a nuclear winter.
In the first place. By the way, when he says things like, how exactly would you justify, why are we talking about how many lives it would save? It's just wrong to drop the bomb. Well, no, actually, if you end up saving more lives than are cost by the dropping of the atomic bomb, then it is morally justified to drop the atomic bomb. And that happens to be the reality of the situation. Evan Thomas wrote in the Washington Post fairly recently, the commanders of the Japanese armed forces were fanatics. On August 9th, after Washington dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, Japan's war minister, General Korichika Anami, asked his fellow members of the Supreme War Council, quote,
yes,
would not it be wondrous for the whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower? The rulers were fatalistic about taking the rest of the nation with them. The 1 million will die for the emperor was a common headline in the state-controlled press. Even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed, and after the Russians had even invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, 6 members of the Supreme War Council deadlocked 3-3 on whether to surrender. After the dropping of the second bomb, when Emperor Hirohito decided that he wanted to end the debate and surrender, he had to run away from members of his own military who were threatening to kidnap him and who were trying to find the recording of him surrendering before it could be broadcast on radio to destroy the recording. So, yes, it turns out that it was necessary. By the way, if we had not dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the alternative was either an amphibious assault that would have cost probably 1 million American lives, or, more likely, a giant blockade of the island of Japan, including the mass starvation of the civilian population, which would have resulted in millions of dead Japanese. So, why is Tucker just abandoning the moral equation here at all? What is he doing here? That's what's sort of fascinating. Now, I think to understand what Tucker's doing here, you have to understand that this particular interview included a lot of conspiratorial thinking. So he tries to explain it. He says that he was actually radicalized by 2017. That basically, until 2017, he believed a lot of narratives that were told by the government and by the mainstream media. And then after 2016, 2017, when it appeared that the intelligence community was militarized against Donald Trump, this is what radicalized him into basically becoming uber critical of everything. This is his story.
Probably unlike you, I didn't have any opinions like that. I was like, fluoride, come on.
Yeah.
UFOs, you're crazy. You know what I mean? I just I had this
What did you learn about fluoride? What did you want to teach the class about fluoride? Please go on. Yes. They're putting fluoride in the drinking water. It's turning us all gay or something.
I'm ashamed of it. I'm not bragging about it. But it was 2017, and really it was the Trump campaign. It wasn't that I was like so in love with Trump, though I've always liked Trump because he's like hilarious and charming and all that. But I wasn't
charming
like a Trumper or anything. But it was watching that campaign, and particularly his claim that they were spying on him, and I was like, really, you're not. The intel services and federal law enforcement, FBI, do not spy on presidential campaigns. Like, that's so out of the realm. That's so crazy. Like, that could never happen because, of course, there's no democracy in a system like that. And fundamentally, we're a democracy, an imperfect one. It kind of lumbers along, but, like, it's not fake. And then that turned out to be true. And I knew it was true. And that just blew my mind. So I began a process still ongoing of reassessing a lot of other things. Like, okay, well, if that was not true, what else is not true? And what else that they told me was a conspiracy theory might actually have some basis in fact. And
that's like kind of funny because that is how most conspiracy theorists get into the whole game, right? It's like, oh, well, I was told a narrative. I believed it my whole life. And then I found out about there's actual covert operations that take place, there's a lot of bad things the government itself has done. And I had no idea. And then as I went down that rabbit hole, that's where I learned fluoride bad. It was only a matter of time.
Okay, so in other words, he went all the way from, I believe all the narratives to I believe none of the narratives. In fact, I believe the counter of the set of facts with which I am presented. Now, first of all, let me just say about 2016, 2017. Yes, it is incredibly disturbing that the intelligence community was militarized against Donald Trump on the basis of a bunch of trumped up nonsense from the Hillary Clinton campaign. Also, if this exploded your worldview as a conservative, that I find that surprising. Because as a conservative, you're supposed to be generally skeptical of government power. And not only that, if you know anything about presidential history, you know that a wide variety of presidential campaigns have been spied on by the administration in power. In 1940, for example, the Wendell Willkie campaign was pretty clearly spied on by the FBI at the behest of FDR. In 1964, LBJ literally bugged Barry Goldwater's headquarters in 1964. Famously, in 1972, the Richard Nixon campaign spied on the campaign of George McGovern, right? That's what Watergate was all about. So actually, there's a fairly well-predicated history of the instruments of law enforcement being...
I feel like Ben is going through puberty in this segment. Oh, wait, we're on to the ads. Still better than Twitter.
Yes. Much of what Tucker says. There's truth, a lot of truth, to the idea that a lot of our powerful institutions have been corrupted and that people inside those institutions have used that power in order to lie and change the narrative. But there is a difference, again, between healthy skepticism, a demand for evidence. That's what skepticism is. Right? Being critical, being a critical thing.
Ron Skifc or Ron SKFC, thank you so much for the $4.99. It's funny that Tucker is off the air and Jon Stewart is back on. Wow, true. Yeah. Who won? I'd say John won.
Thinker is a demand for evidence. That is not the same thing as just asking questions. Just asking questions means the search for answers is totally worthless. And all the answers are deemed insufficient anyway. When you start thinking that being a critical thinker is just the asking of the questions rather than critically evaluating evidence and claims and counterclaims, that's wrong.
Okay. Well, then let's look at the evidence. It's time to watch a 4-hour Sean video. No, but you should watch Sean's video on the atomic bomb. It's very good. It goes into quite a bit of detail. Some of the things that he speaks of are sourced in this article, though, on Rational Wiki again. The atomic bombing of the Japanese city of Hiroshima, quickly followed by the bombing of Nagasaki on October 6th and 9th of August 1945, respectively, established that the Greek myth of opening Pandora's box had real-life consequences. The combined death toll of at least 200,000 people, the attacks that marked the end of World War II, and a number of surrender of Imperial Japan, the culmination of the Manhattan Project, and doomed human civilization to 70 years of threatening apocalypse for strategic gain. So, why? The military necessity argument. The ethical justifications for nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain in considerable debate. Proponents, including President Harry Truman, who never recanted his decision to drop the bombs, maintains that it was necessary to measure to prevent a costly invasion of Japan, with casualties expected to be in the millions. However, opponents say it was state terrorism or genocidal, and question whether its military necessity as Soviet forces were already cornering Manchuria from the north and the war in Europe was over. The idea of a fanatical Japanese warrior state that would fight to the bitter end, with images of school children and housewives using bamboo spears to defeat the God Emperor, or to defend the God Emperor, was often invoked, and those did have some basis in reality. American, Australia, and other allied forces have seen Japanese troops would often die in futile exchanges or commit ritual suicide rather than surrender. At the Battle of Okinawa, Japan used child soldiers, forced civilian populations into makeshift military units, and instructed them to kill themselves rather than surrender. Of the 5 Japanese commanders at Okinawa, only 1 was captured alive. A war memorial on Okinawa shows that almost 80,000 Japanese soldiers died there, along with 150,000 civilians. Only 7,000 Japanese soldiers were taken as prisoners of war, and on the night of August 14th, 1945, 8 days after the bombing of Hiroshima and 5 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, a cabal of Japanese military officers attempted to overthrow the emperor to prevent the surrender in what was known as the Kyujo incident. A study performed by the physicist William Shockley for the staff of the Secretary of War Henry Stimson estimated the invasion of Japan could have cost around 1.7 to 4 million American casualties, including 400,000 to 800,000 casualties, and 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths. The estimate were twice the number of American deaths in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific Theater. The U.S. planned to drop the bomb a few days later after the second, following the total of 12 additional atomic bombs. Futsuo Fushida, leader of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, agreed that the atomic bombings were necessary during a conversation with Air Force General Paul Tibbets. On the other hand, the University of Chicago political scientist Robert Pape was suggested that if the U.S. was willing to budget just a little on some issues, not demanding the total surrender from the Japanese, letting the emperor go on pretending to be a living god, a settlement could have been reached before the bombings. This opinion is strongly supported by internal Japanese government messages intercepted by the Allies at the time. Archived copies and lengthy and highly detailed telegram correspondence between Japanese Foreign Minister and Affairs Shigenori Togo and Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union Naotake Sato demonstrate this. In telegram July 94 dispatch from Togo to Sato on July 25th, 1945, Togo states, "As for Japan, it is impossible to accept the unconditional surrender under any circumstances, but we would like to communicate to the other party through appropriate channels that we have no objection to a peace based on the Atlantic Charter. The difficult point is the altitude of the enemy, who continues to insist on the formality of unconditional surrender. Should the United States and Great Britain remain insistent on formality, there is no solution to the situation other than for us to hold out complete collapse because of this one point alone. The situation was this: Japan refused to surrender unconditionally, but the Allies wouldn't be accepting anything less. Thus, the United States had a choice. They could either launch a ground invasion, codename Operation Downfall, which would have caused even more casualties on both sides, or continue the existing naval blockade and bombing raids until the eventual surrender happened. Truman confirms this state of affairs with the following entry in his diary: "I have to decide Japanese strategy. Shall we invade Japan proper, or shall we bomb and blockade?" Furthermore, according to the summary report of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, certain of the United States commanders and representatives of the survey who were called back from the investigations in Germany of June 1945 in consultation stated the belief that, by the coordinated impact of the blockade and direct air attack, Japan could be forced to surrender without invasion. Note the summary report specifies that the consultation was in June 1945 and the Trinity test didn't take place until the middle of July 1945. So when they said this, they didn't know atomic bombs would be available. So dropping the atomic bomb was not the only alternative to a ground invasion. Consequently, any narrative to the effect that the atomic bombs were necessary to save American lives is false. The Japanese did have a plan to resist the possible invasion called Operation Ketsugo and called for the glorious death of 100 million Japanese citizens in defense of the emperor. However, since the US had already enacted a massive sea blockade, a ground invasion was unnecessary and therefore definitely did not guarantee to happen. Even some of the highest ranking members of the American military were firmly against it. Dwight D. Eisenhower himself said the following, quote, "In 1945, Secretary of War Stimson visited the headquarters in Germany, informed me that our government was preparing to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. I was one of those who felt that there was a number of cogent reasons to question the wisdom of such an act. During his recitation of relevant facts, I had been conscious of the feeling of depression, and so I voiced with my grave misgivings, first on the basis of the belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." Fleet Admiral William D. Leahy, America's most senior military officer during World War II, didn't mince words. Quote, "It is my opinion that the use of the barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance to our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and successful bombing with conventional weapons. My own feeling was that, it first being to use it, we had adopted the ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make wars in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." And just to put this point firmly to bed, later in the summary report, the US government admits that it was not only a ground invasion was completely unnecessary, so was the atomic bomb. Quote, "Based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that, certainly prior to the 31st of December 1945, and in all probability prior to November 1st, 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, even if there was no invasion that had been planned or contemplated." Page 107. But that's not to say the bombs didn't accomplish nothing at all, because they gave us a nuclear arms race, which lasted 45 years. Some view the bombing of Japan rather than Germany as racist. Others look at the Japanese World War II propaganda posters confirming that it may be a reasonable theory. Bomb apologists often point out that Germany surrendered in early May 1945 before the bomb was ready, but the Manhattan Project Director General Leslie R. Groves asserted that Japan was always supposed to have been the target of the bombs even before Germany surrendered. In a hypothetical scenario where Germany got nuked and Japan didn't, one could argue that the decision of where to drop the bombs was strongly influenced by racism. In another scenario where both countries get nuked, the lack of racism involved nuking Germany does not mean that nuking Japan wasn't racist. Racism could have been, and likely was, just one of the contributing factors in the decision, and Truman himself had some less than egalitarian views on the enemy, as expressed in a written response to Telegram Senator Richard Russell Jr. Note the letter is dated August 9th, the same day Nagasaki was bombed, and 3 days after Hiroshima was bombed. "Dear Dick, I read your telegrams on August 7th with a lot of interest. I know Japan is a terribly cruel and uncivilized nation in warfare, but I can't bring myself to believe that because they are beasts, we should ourselves act in the same manner. For myself, I certainly regret the necessity of wiping out whole populations because of the, quote, pig-headedness of the leaders of a nation, and for your information, I'm not going to do it unless absolutely necessary. It is my opinion that after the Russians enter into the war, the Japanese will shortly fold up." The telegram letter refers to quite a doozy. Senator Russell outright insists on nuking Japan until they beg for unconditional surrender. This article, obviously, does explain that there is it's something that is still obviously highly contested to this day, and I know a lot of people have most likely watched Sean's video on the subject, which I think is probably one of the most thorough YouTube videos that actually explores the morality, the ethics, and the necessity to bombing Japan. I know Oliver Stone put out a series on American history that goes way off into full-blown conspiracy, 9/11 truther stuff. The earlier stuff talking about this period references a lot of the back channel conversations that were taking place at the time, which I think again are very worth studying and taking a look at. There's obviously the aspect of the fact that Japan as a ultra nationalistic dictatorship themselves at the time under the emperor were absolutely fucking horrifying, and none of this is to downplay the war crimes, atrocities, and mass rapes that were committed by the Japanese at the time, but again, getting down to in the modern era where I see people who immediately talk about this period in human history with just like, it had to happen. There was no other way. Japan had to get bombed. They had to get nuked. And it was the only way to prevent a ground invasion. It saved, again, millions of American lives. We took out hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in exchange for millions of American soldiers, and that calculation, while fucked up and cruel and monstrous in its scale, is still a necessity. That is pretty much the narrative that again at an elementary school level, when it came to the history of World War II, that is the kind of stuff that was being taught. Not let's look at this point in history and what exactly was taking place and what took place before the bombing, and were those conditions one in which there could have been no alternative. And to that, I disagree strongly.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. We first want to give a shout out to everyone who makes this show possible. This program is produced thanks to the generous support of our Patreon supporters: Anna Loves Riley, Ariane McCarthy, Cheryl Alvarez, Comrade Junkie, Doug Caddy, Everything Important, Hagbar Celine, Jimmy Sombrero, Multimondi, Omni, Peanut Butter Blondie, Political Poppy, Preston Kroll, Quiet 185, Richard Bomey, Riley and Anna, Roller Dragon, Ruby, Cernicus, Stellar Gwyn, Sebastian Demmel, Travis McClinton, and Words Greenwood, as well as every other person you see on the screen right now. This show would not be possible without them. And if you want to join these wonderful people who make this entire program possible, simply go to patreon.com/the Serfs and you can unlock uncensored and bonus episodes and, help us exist.